What I thought I'd do is touch on a couple maybe of the more technical issues related to tax and talking to people during the break. The first one I want to touch on is the local composite index. How many people here are familiar with that? Just raise your hands. It's about half the room. So just briefly, the local composite index, it's a formula with numerators and denominators. And what it basically does is it comes up with a number, and it's a number relative to every locality in Virginia that determines their ability to pay given the wealth of that jurisdiction. And how this is relevant to industrial scale solar is that the total value of real estate is factored into the numerator. And so that includes not just the land value of the real estate, but any of the improvements on the land. And what happens is the Department of Tax for each jurisdiction, it gives to the Department of Education, which doles out the K through 12 dollars based on this formula. It gives what that total value of real estate is. Well, and Darren remembers this because working in Mecklenburg, when Mecklenburg was considering one of the many utility scale solar, and there's a reason why they got so many, I'll touch on that in a second, is they had somebody look at the taxes and say, hey, wait a second, it's showing on the total value of real estate what would be the value of the solar panels, but it doesn't factor into that 80% of that value is not taxed. So, long story short, the Department of Tax, Commissioner Craig Burns, wrote a letter to, I think it was McGuire Woods Consulting, that said, hey, we recognize that this should be discounted. So when we give those numbers to the Department of Ed going forward, any of the solar equipment is going to be at that discounted value. So we think that issue may have been addressed. But you never know. There's a lot of nuances with it. I would say stay tuned. The other thing about the LCI is it's like the current LCI we're under, I think it's based on tax year 2016, which there was no utility scale solar on the books in 2016. So moving forward, we'll see how that works. Just another sidelight to that is what's interesting about this is the commissioner based his ruling on the fact that it wasn't a voluntary tax at the local level, it was a mandatory tax abatement. If you know anything about land use valuation at the local level, and I think that was the other question I had about rollback taxes, localities have the option to tax forest and agricultural land at a lower rate. That discount doesn't get factored into the LCI, and that's an issue, another sidelining issue we always deal with. But since this was a mandatory tax, that's what the commission was basing it on. What's interesting about that is the whole mandatory tax exemption for solar equipment is in the section of code dealing with air pollution control equipment. So air pollution control equipment, take a scrubber on a smokestack for a coal-fired power plant. That was in 2009. That was a mandatory exemption from local machine and tool tax, local property tax. So with this commissioner's ruling, if you live in a jurisdiction that has a coal-fired power plant, lo and behold, this is going to help you out. So Chesterfield County, which has a huge coal-field power plant, moving forward, that will not be counted in the total value of real estate. So that's just kind of a sidelight issue there. On the rollback taxes, how many here are familiar with land use valuation? Okay, so that's that option I talked about. So when a developer comes in and takes ag or forestal land that's in land use valuation and they put it into utility scale solar, it's no longer being farmed or being forested. So then you tax it at a higher rate, which now should be at a commercial rate, not an agricultural rate. And what I would say is, if there's any questions, go to your local commissioner of revenue, because they need to get this straight. I've talked to the lobbyist that represents them, and I think it's pretty much common knowledge that once you change the use from agricultural to utility scale solar, it's a commercial operation, so you should be taxed at that level. But part of that land use valuation, anytime you take it out of that use, there's a 5-year look back, and you pay the taxes on it at those rollback taxes that you would have paid if it wasn't in that use. Hopefully that makes sense. One issue I wanted to touch on, and it goes to Darren's question earlier for Steve, the numbers you saw there for North Carolina. I talked to Steve during the break. He's got my card. He's going to send me the data because he had some graduate students look at it. I'm wondering whether they might not have caught the 80% exemption on their property tax, which is very similar to Virginia. So we're going to maybe...
I think I figured it out. That's aggregate per county, and they've got multiple facilities. I'm used to looking at one at a time.
One at a time, that's probably, yes.
Still, if that 80% go back to the localities, more people will be happier
Well,
about
that's what I was going to touch on. So we touched on this 80%, anything over 20 megawatts, it's a mandatory 80% exemption. I think Patrick had in his presentation that starting July 1st of this year, if you're 150 megawatts and above, you don't get that mandatory exemption. I was the one that put that bill in. We had Senator, I'm thinking of the senator's name now, put that bill in for us. The reason we did it, why did VaCo put in this? Our argument wasn't that we were taking away the tax exemption as a tax incentive. We were putting it back in the hands of the locals as an option to do any sort of tax subsidy on the machinery pool. And the reason is this. Back in 2017, the PBR, permit by rule, which we learned about earlier, it went up to 150 megawatts that you could go to permit by rule, to DEQ. We started looking at the applications coming in Surrey County, in Suffolk County. We were seeing these 150 megawatt projects coming in at 2,000 acres. I mean, we're talking now square miles. We're not talking, that. And so we felt at that scale, it really should be a discussion between the developer and the locality. What is, the incentive here? Now, what's interesting about the legislation, and this goes back to S-Power, and I think it goes back, I wanted you to address with you, which I think you hit the nail on the head, is developers should be going in and having those conversations early and often. I know, is there anybody here from Spotsylvania? Okay, so you know full well that S-Power, you read about it maybe in a press release from the governor's office, or maybe in a Federal Reserve newsletter that, hey, there's the hugest solar power installation in the East Coast and it's coming to Spotsylvania. Woo! Yeah. Spotsylvania didn't know until they got the special use permit application dropped on them in January of this year. Announcements are going out early, right? So, and I think the latest I saw on your all's website is that the application was, they were notified they were incomplete back in June. Have they submitted?
They've been, since then, they've been deemed complete. They've received one technical review comment response letter. They've received another, and we're waiting on them to resubmit. They're looking to hopefully have a public hearing in November. We'll see whether or not we can make that happen.
Yeah, so what's interesting about that is S-Power and their lobbyists didn't know this legislation was going through. And since it's 500 megawatts, this would affect their whole bottom line and their financing. You can imagine that you would get their attention. So they freaked out. It's just a kind way of saying it. Their lobbyist called me up and he was like, man, am I on the hot seat, Joe? Let's talk. They came forward with an amendment to the legislation that the governor put in. We did not oppose it, but it basically said if you've applied for interconnection by June or July 2019 on any project 150 megawatts or greater, then you still get the mandatory 80% exemption. What was interesting about it, and it's just a side note, originally the chief executive for S-Power, and I apologize for anybody who's S-Power in the room, but I read the letter they wrote to the governor. It was pretty haughty. It was basically saying, we're going to pull all our hundreds of millions and billions of dollars out if you don't veto this legislation right now. The governor in his wisdom and his staff said, no, we're not going to veto the legislation. This is good legislation. It's good public policy. But we'll give you this carve-out since you've already made this interconnection request. So, it goes to that point there, and I think, and it goes actually to the debate on the House floor on this. The delegate representing that area, Mark Cole, he, on the first vote on this, had gotten the governor's amendment rejected. And he made the point, he said, look, the developers for S-Power may want this bill actually to pass. And why? Because if it becomes a local option, there may be more room to negotiate on utility scale at this size. Maybe it's 50%. Maybe it declines over a certain number of years. There's a lot of things that could be in that. And then, they went into recess, a lot of calls were made, and then it passed like on a party line vote. So it's what we're with. But what's interesting about the M&T exemption is anything 20 megawatts or greater, and this goes back to when it was modified in 2016. If you haven't started construction by January 1st, 2024, you don't get that 80% exemption, and then goes back to local option. So that's in there. Now, what I'll say about, and this has been our experience, any sort of tax incentive or tax subsidy, you know, if it has a sunset date, those usually get put off by the General Assembly. I don't know about this one, but that's something to consider. I mean, I've heard rumblings, you know, from others that maybe it's time to look at that tax subsidy, particularly for 20 megawatts or greater, and maybe even end it sooner. I can tell you that VaCo, I mean, we wouldn't come forward with that proposal. There's nothing in our legislative program. We also wouldn't oppose it because we think it's the way to go, particularly with these larger projects. I think one thing I'll say, maybe two other quick things, or three other quick things, and then we go to Q&A because I know we're running out of time. You know, one maybe instructive way for a developer to go through, I recently read in Campbell County approved a large utility scale solar, and is Tyson here? Tyson not? I know he's with Apex Energy. Not only did they get approval, but they got approval, and in the newspaper they said, now that we've gotten approval for the land use, we are now going to go through the PBR process, which I thought was pretty interesting. And it dovetails a little bit into one thing I wanted to talk about, and I was talking to Beth about it during the break, is we actually had budget language that would have a look at the PBR process and ways to improve it. We actually had that retracted because we had a discussion with DEQ about them opening up the PBR process for kind of a makeover. And one of those things could be, hey, maybe the locality should be notified with DEQ at the same time of requirement, because, you know, we were getting calls from Culpeper where all of a sudden, you know, their residents were seeing things on the PBR notice of intent and the county hadn't been notified. And so that, you know, that kind of creates some problems. So there's ways to improve that. The other thing I'll say, because it was touched on earlier about stormwater, is there's a budget amendment language that now goes into effect July 1st of this year, that DEQ shall allow for an expedited review process for large land disturbing projects. And 93.7% sure that was put in by solar developers because they're getting hung up on these long reviews, 6 months at a time for these larger projects. So that's something to be aware of. I think, you know, the last thing I'll end is you know, kind of on a positive note, a couple things to think about, and this is forward looking, is I think we can work, localities can work with developers and with the utilities and with PGM on forward looking, and it goes back to what I wanted to point out earlier about Mecklenburg. Why was Mecklenburg inundated by so many applications at one time? They're rich in what? Transmission lines. They had and they had the capacity. There's an interesting provision in state code related to comp plans that localities can actually work with utilities, the income utilities, so APCO and Dominion, and maybe even the electric co-ops, on, of course, electric co-ops don't really plan for expansion with transmission, they don't really build transmission, but you can help with them designate and mold corridors for transmission lines of 150 kV or greater. So those discussions could be happening now. Where do you want those to go? You know, we talked about the types of land that are available. Maybe you don't want, you know, the capacity to go towards where you have your prime agricultural lands, your best soils. So those are some things to think about, you know, moving forward. I think that's it. I mean, we'll go to Q&A, and I'll stay for a little while if there's any questions.
Okay. Great, thanks, guys. So you hear a little bit more about sort of the different attributes of the fiscal considerations that go into developing projects, both at the utility scale side, but also the smaller scale stuff, and how the public policy conversation is trying to mitigate some of those questions, both on the development communities, but also sort of how the taxation is applied at the local level and where it's going. One of the issues that didn't come up, and maybe Carly, you can talk about this, as well as Crystal, I know you guys have dealt with this in the city, is CPACE programs, how they come into being, and Joe, you can talk a little bit about this as well, and what the potential is in trying to forward some of the, or sort of mitigate the cost of development for rooftop, while at the same time promoting the development of the marketplace.
So for those of you that aren't familiar with CPACE,
Yeah, I think you can turn it on.
no.
There you go. Yep.
CPACE, Community Property Assessed Clean Energy, is a way that you can finance not just solar, but energy efficiency. And what a company, business, commercial entity can do is actually attach the cost of deploying those assets, energy efficiency measures and or solar, to your property assessment. And so you can pay it back like a mortgage over a 30-year period of time. So the state of Virginia passed this legislation, I guess, a few years ago. It's only been begun to be implemented in Arlington at this point. Charlottesville, it's under consideration, but hasn't been passed yet. There is one, I mean, I know we're in Virginia, but there's an active CPACE program in DC. There are commercial PACE programs around the country. There are also residential PACE programs so that you can apply it on a residential basis. That is not what is contemplated currently in the state of Virginia. But that's essentially it, and it's another vehicle and financing mechanism to remove barriers to basically have the opportunity to deploy clean energy assets.
Yeah, I'll just add that it requires a local ordinance to be passed. So that's one thing I would say. If you go to the VaCo website, I think it's 2 newsletters ago, we ran an article on it, and we gave the contact information. I think it's for Dan Farrell with Dean and me. So Ken, if you got questions, ask Ken about it. But it has the potential to, I think, do a couple things. One, it has the potential to create economic activity because you're going to be getting jobs and people working on energy efficiency. And so I think that's great. And then it also could raise the value of the property. So there's some potentials there.
And to that point, I'm just going to add on to that. So, there are several programs out there that have basically tied the deployment of both energy efficiency and solar to increase property values. There's a residential program, Pearl Certification, that was actually created by Cynthia Adams, which is really focused more on and contemplates more of the residential side of things, so that if you get solar installed on your house and or energy efficiency, they will come out and certify it. And that kind of registration and certification process actually increases or can increase your value and your ability to sell your property. All of the studies that have currently been done on a national basis, be it residential and or commercial, is that valuations increase on your property when you deploy both energy efficiency and or solar. So it really is a good investment for the property owners, not just in the near term, but the long-term viability for selling. So you get a value of actually having a generation resource and asset, reducing potentially your energy consumption, as well as long-term opportunity to have a good return on your investment.
Okay. And let me know if you guys have questions. I'm trying to go down these threads that have come up during the day and make sure we get some answers for you.
Sure, so I'm Ed Gilliland with the Solar Foundation, and just wanted to circle back on PACE, Property Assessed Clean Energy. It just so happens, and also we're involved with what's called the Mid-Atlantic PACE Alliance. We work with the state on that, the state of Virginia, and other organizations around the Mid-Atlantic. It just so happens there's a webinar taking place today for public officials on PACE. But the good news is you haven't missed it because it is being recorded. So I encourage you to, if you want to check out the Mid-Atlantic PACE Alliance website, that webinar will be up recorded specifically for PACE for local officials in Virginia.
Thanks, Ed.
I do want to, it kind of brings up another thing. I know we're talking about PACE specifically, but if you're talking about removing barriers and what the barriers are potentially, both on a residential and commercial side of things to go solar, it's about, access to capital to actually purchase and or, get into some sort of financial arrangement. Up until 18 months ago, there was not financing for simply residential solar in the state of Virginia. 18 months ago. There are millions of solar systems deployed in the world, and it took us until 18 months ago to do it. So all of that saying, financing is available that basically allows homeowners, businesses, et cetera, to go solar with quite literally zero money down, which means you get an immediate financial benefit from day one that that system is electrified. So you are not taking as much risk.
Is there any other questions regarding the fiscal stuff? I think you guys have heard quite a bit about these things over the day. I will make sure we get this on tape so that we can say it out loud at some point. The Department of Taxation issued a letter saying how the CI is going to be calculated regarding solar. Can localities rely on that? And does it require that we go and get a legislative solution at some point?
You know, I'm not a lawyer, but I'll give a lawyerly answer. It depends. No, I think you can. I mean, I think what the way that works, particularly if it's 25 megawatts or greater, the SCC is actually giving that value to tax, and then tax will give that to DOE. So it's going to be in there. You know, there may be a question about smaller installations, but I have to imagine even 20 megawatts. You know, that's going to be the value moving forward. But you know, I guess the answer is I don't know if it requires clarification. I mean, the problem with the LCI is it's not even in state code. I mean, it might be technically in budget language, and that's going to be, I think, looked at one day. Yeah.
And just to reiterate that, so any project that's installed at 25 megawatts or greater, SCC does the valuation of the land and the project, and then calculates that and gives the numbers to DOE. So if you're a locality, you're going to be doing the valuation for that project in-house and then farming that information back up to SCC.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of just administrative cost.
Let me ask a question. Because I know Patrick, he had the 25 megawatts, I think, in his slide. And did y'all learn, I mean, if you're 25 megawatts or greater, if you have the machine and tool tax, you don't apply your statutory rate on your machine and tool tax, whatever that is. It might be like $1.35 per $100 of assessed value. You actually apply your underlying real estate tax. So if you're considering one of these at the local level, make sure your commissioner of revenue on the same page, and that you will be getting less revenue, even of the 20% of the revenue you're going to get from your machine and tool tax.
Okay. Well, let's thank these guys, and I will close us up here. So thank you all, three of you, for being on the panel this afternoon. Really appreciate that.